My name is Clayton. Normally, I'm the kind of man who keeps his feelings bottled up, believing it's better to deal with things silently than to make waves. But right now, it feels like if I don't let this out, I might just fall apart. This is my story. A story I never imagined would become my life. It all began a few months ago. I work as a mechanical engineer, and my life has always been steady, predictable even. I wake up at 6:30 every morning, go for a jog with my dog, Max, and head to work. My wife, Miriam, usually has her coffee in hand by the time I leave, and she always waves at me from the kitchen window as I back out of the driveway. It's a small ritual, but one I've always loved. Miriam and I have been married for 11 years. She's the kind of person who lights up a room, a social butterfly who loves hosting dinners, planning vacations, and making people laugh. She's always had this spark, this energy that drew me to her when we first met. I thought we had a great life together. But looking back now, I realized that the first warning sign was so subtle I almost missed it. One evening, Miriam came home later than usual. She said she'd been catching up with an old friend, someone she hadn't seen in years. She seemed happy, almost giddy, as she told me about their conversation. I didn't think much of it at the time. Why would I? We both had our lives outside of each other, and I'd always trusted her completely. Then came the changes. Little things at first. Miriam started paying more attention to her appearance, something she'd always done but now seemed different. She bought new clothes, sleek dresses and heels that she wouldn't typically wear to work. She started spending more time at the gym, even on weekends, which she'd never been particularly interested in before. Trying to keep up with the younger crowd at work? I joked one evening as she laced up her sneakers. She laughed and brushed it off, saying, "Just trying to feel good about myself. That's all." I didn't press her on it. I figured everyone deserves to feel good about themselves, right? But as the weeks went by, her behavior became harder to ignore. She started texting more, her phone always in her hand, and when I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd say it was her work group or her sister. One Saturday morning, as I sat on the couch reading the newspaper, Miriam walked into the room dressed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Tight jeans, a fitted blouse, her hair styled just so. She looked stunning, but it caught me off guard. "You're dressed up," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Where are you off to?" "Just meeting a friend for lunch," she replied casually. "What friend?" I asked, not out of suspicion but genuine curiosity. "Oh, just a girl from work," she said, avoiding eye contact as she gathered her things. "You don't know her." That was the first time I felt the faint tug of doubt in my chest. I didn't push her, though. I didn't want to be that husband, the one who questions his wife's every move. I wanted to believe her, but the nagging feeling didn't go away. Over the next few weeks, her late nights became more frequent. The excuses, work events, catching up with friends, errands, started to sound rehearsed. And then there was the moment that changed everything. One evening, as Miriam was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I glanced at it out of habit, not expecting anything unusual. But the message on the screen stopped me cold. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible." The name attached to the message was someone I didn't recognize. Brett. My heart sank, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Who was Brett? What did he mean by last night? I felt like the walls were closing in around me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't jump to conclusions, not yet. But deep down, I knew that my life, the life I thought was so solid and unshakable, was starting to unravel. That night, I lay awake next to Miriam, listening to her soft, steady breathing, while my mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to ask. Was she unhappy? Had I missed the signs? And most importantly, how long had this been going on? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. The foundation of my marriage was starting to crack, and I wasn't sure if it could be repaired. The morning after I saw that message, I felt like I was sleepwalking through my life. Miriam acted like everything was normal, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone while I made breakfast. I couldn't bring myself to look at her the same way. My heart felt heavy, and my mind was racing with questions, but I kept quiet. "Do you have any plans today?" she asked, her tone light and casual. Just the usual, I said, forcing a smile. Work. Then maybe I'll stop by the hardware store. She nodded, barely looking up. It struck me how distant she seemed, like she was in another world entirely. That entire day at work, I couldn't focus. I kept replaying that message in my mind, dissecting every word, wondering who Brett was and how deep this thing went. Part of me wanted to confront her right away, to demand an explanation, but another part of me was terrified of what I might hear. What if it was worse than I imagined? By the time I got home, I had made up my mind. I needed more information before I could confront her. I hated myself for it, but I started paying closer attention to her actions. I noticed how she always kept her phone face down on the table, how she stepped into another room whenever she took a call, and how her laughter seemed different. Less genuine, more guarded. A few days later, I got my first real clue. Miriam had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs. She rarely used it, preferring her phone, but something told me to take a closer look. My hands shook as I clicked on the email app, and there it was. An exchange between her and Brett. The messages were flirty, playful, and laced with inside jokes that made me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. But the one that hit me hardest was simple. I'll be thinking about you all day, beautiful. Can't wait for tonight. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Tonight? What was happening tonight? I closed the laptop quickly as I heard Miriam's footsteps on the stairs. My heart was racing, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. What's for dinner? She asked, breezing into the kitchen like nothing was wrong. I was thinking pasta, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Miriam was glued to her phone, smiling at texts she didn't bother to hide anymore. I tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash in my mouth. That night, after she went to bed, I stayed up, sitting in the darkened living room with Max curled up at my feet. I felt a wave of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, but mostly, I felt lost. How had it come to this? Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? The next morning, I decided I needed to know more. If I was going to confront her, I wanted to have all the facts. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. Miriam had told me she was going to a work meeting, but instead of heading downtown, she drove to a small cafe on the other side of town. I parked a few spaces away and watched as she got out of the car, her face lighting up as a man approached her. Brett. I didn't need anyone to tell me it was him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He leaned in and kissed Miriam on the cheek, his hand lingering on her waist in a way that made my stomach churn. I stayed in my car, watching as they sat by the window, laughing and talking like they didn't have a care in the world. It was surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. When they left the cafe, they walked to Brett's car. He opened the door for her, and she climbed in, her smile brighter than I'd seen in months. As they drove off, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I felt a mix of emotions. Rage, despair, humiliation. But underneath it all was a quiet determination. I wasn't ready to give up on my marriage, not without a fight. But I also knew I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. That night, Miriam came home as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and even suggested we watch a movie together. I went along with it, pretending everything was fine, but inside, I was breaking. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized I had a decision to make. I could confront her with what I knew, or I could keep gathering information and wait for the right moment. For now, I decided to wait. I wasn't ready to face the truth, but I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The days that followed felt like a test of endurance, of how much pain a person can carry while pretending everything is normal. Miriam went about her life as if nothing was amiss. She still smiled at me in the mornings, still laughed at my corny jokes, and still sat beside me on the couch at night. But the distance between us grew wider with every passing day, even if she didn't realize it. I, on the other hand, couldn't escape the constant weight in my chest. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. How long had this been going on? What did Brett have that I didn't? And most of all, was there any chance to salvage what we had? Or had she already decided to leave me behind? One evening, while Miriam was out, this time claiming it was a yoga class, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop. The memory of those emails still haunted me, but I needed more. Something definitive. Something that would either confirm my fears or give me some shred of hope to hold on to. I opened her email again, but this time I dug deeper. What I found sent a chill down my spine. There were reservations for a hotel booked in both her and Brett's names. 3 nights at a cozy lodge upstate. The dates were just a week away. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. She had planned an entire getaway, and she hadn't even bothered to hide it. Was she that confident I wouldn't notice? Or had she stopped caring altogether? I closed the laptop, feeling a surge of anger and heartbreak that left me breathless. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I confront her now? Should I wait until she left for the trip and catch her in the act? Or should I just walk away and let her have what she wanted? But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. That night I couldn't sleep. Miriam came home late, her face flushed and glowing in a way that made me sick. She kissed me on the forehead and said she was exhausted, then went straight to bed. I sat up in the living room, staring at the darkened TV screen, my thoughts circling like vultures. The next morning I made a decision. If she was planning this trip, I needed to see what she would do if I subtly tested her. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned, I was thinking of taking some time off work next week. Maybe we could plan a little getaway. Just the 2 of us. Her reaction was subtle but telling. She froze for a fraction of a second, her fork hovering mid-air, before she smiled and said, That sounds nice, but I have so much going on at work right now. Maybe we can plan something later? Later? I echoed, forcing a smile. Sure. She bought my response without a second thought. That hurt more than I expected. How could she lie to me so easily? How could she sit across from me, wearing the wedding ring I had placed on her finger, and plan a life with someone else? I spent the next few days preparing myself for what was to come. I needed to stay calm, focused. I couldn't let my emotions get the better of me, no matter how much it hurt. I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I noticed. Every text she hid, every time she came home late, every excuse that didn't add up. The journal became my lifeline, a place where I could unload the storm of emotions raging inside me. Anger, sadness, confusion. It was all there, scrawled across the pages. It helped me keep my head clear, to focus on what mattered. The night before her planned trip, Miriam seemed more distant than ever. She said she had to work late again and wouldn't be home until late. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but inside, I was bracing myself for what was to come. When she finally walked through the door, she seemed lighter, almost carefree. She kissed me on the cheek, told me she was exhausted, and went straight to bed. I stayed up, staring at the clock, knowing that in less than 24 hours, my life would change forever. The next morning, I watched her pack her bags. She said it was for a work retreat, and that she'd be back in a few days. I nodded, biting back the questions that threatened to spill out. As she stood by the door, suitcase in hand, she hesitated for a moment. I love you, she said softly. The words felt hollow, like an echo of something that used to mean so much more. I forced a smile and replied, I love you too. And just like that, she was gone. I stood there in the empty house, the silence almost deafening. My heart ached, but I knew I couldn't let it break me. This wasn't over, not yet. I grabbed my car keys and followed her, keeping a safe distance as she drove out of town. When she pulled into the parking lot of the lodge, Brett was already there, waiting for her. She ran into his arms, laughing as he spun her around. I stayed in my car, watching from a distance, my chest tightening with every second. This was it, the proof I needed. But as I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, a new thought entered my mind. What was I going to do now? As I sat in my car, watching Miriam and Brett embrace like a pair of star-crossed lovers. The weight of the situation began to settle in. My wife, my partner of over a decade, was here in this idyllic lodge with another man. The scene in front of me felt surreal, almost like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My breathing was shallow, and my mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. Should I confront her right here and now? Should I barge into their romantic getaway and demand answers? Or should I drive away, take some time to think, and decide how to approach this calmly? The thought of confrontation felt like walking into a storm without an umbrella. I wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, I grabbed my phone and took a few pictures. Felt wrong, violating even, but I needed evidence. Evidence for myself, for the inevitable confrontation, and maybe even for closure. As I clicked the shutter, I couldn't help but notice how happy she looked. That was the part that stung the most. The way she leaned into Brett, laughing at something he said, her body language so open and carefree. She hadn't laughed like that around me in months. Maybe longer. Once I had what I needed, I drove off. My heart felt like it was being crushed under the weight of 1,000 bricks. The road blurred in front of me as tears welled up, but I blinked them away, determined to stay focused. When I got home, the silence of the house felt unbearable. Max greeted me at the door, wagging his tail, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I sat on the couch, running my hands through his fur, trying to calm myself down. And then it hit me. This wasn't just about Miriam and Brett. This was about me too. How had I let things get to this point? Was I so blind, so naive, that I hadn't seen the signs earlier? I spent the rest of the day pacing the house, replaying every moment of our marriage in my mind. The happy times, the fights, the moments of quiet companionship. It all felt so far away now, like a distant memory from another life. That evening, as I sat in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee I didn't even want, I decided it was time to take control. I couldn't let this betrayal define me. I couldn't let it consume me, but I also couldn't ignore it. I pulled out my laptop and started writing. Not to Miriam, not to Brett, but to myself. I needed to organize my thoughts, to make sense of the chaos in my mind. I wrote down everything I was feeling. Every ounce of anger, sadness, and confusion. As the words spilled onto the screen, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Miriam's infidelity. This was about my own journey, about figuring out what I wanted and how I was going to move forward. The next day, Miriam called me from the lodge. Her voice was warm, cheerful even, as she asked how I was doing. Just fine, I said, keeping my tone neutral. How's the work retreat? Oh, it's great, she replied. Her lie so casual it made my stomach turn. Lots of team-building activities and networking. You'd probably find it boring. I bit back a bitter laugh. Yeah, probably. For the rest of the call, I let her talk, pretending to listen as she spun her web of lies. It was almost impressive, the ease with which she lied to me. When she hung up, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to scream, to break something, to let out all the frustration that had been building inside me. But another part of me felt calm. This wasn't just her betrayal anymore. It was her choice to keep lying, to keep pretending, even when she had the chance to come clean. Over the next few days, I kept myself busy. I went to work, walked Max, and spent my evenings writing. The more I wrote, the more I realized that I needed to focus on myself. Not on Miriam, not on Brett, but on rebuilding the life I wanted. By the time Miriam came home from her so-called work retreat, I was ready, or at least as ready as I could be. She walked through the door, suitcase in hand, her face glowing with the same happiness I'd seen at the lodge. Hi, honey, she said, setting her bag down. Miss me? I looked at her, searching for some hint of remorse, some flicker of guilt. But there was nothing. Of course, I said, forcing a smile. How was the retreat? Oh, it was fine, she said, brushing past me. Exhausting, though. I'm going to unpack and take a shower. As she disappeared upstairs, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the photos on my phone. This was it, the moment of truth. I knew I couldn't keep this charade going much longer. I had to confront her, to lay everything out in the open. But I also knew that once I did, there would be no going back. And that was the scariest part of all. As Miriam showered upstairs, I sat in the kitchen, replaying every word of her cheerful greeting. She walked through the door without a trace of guilt, kissed me like nothing was wrong, and called me honey, as if she wasn't betraying everything we had built. When she came back downstairs, her hair still damp and her expression calm, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew this was it. "Miriam, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She froze for a second, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "Sure, what's up?" I gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table. She hesitated but eventually sat across from me, folding her hands in her lap. "Where were you this weekend?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. She blinked, surprised by my tone. "I told you it was a work retreat." I leaned forward, holding her gaze. "You're lying." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unrelenting. Her face went pale, and she looked away, fumbling for something to say. "Clayton, I don't know what you're—" "I know about Brett," I interrupted, my voice sharper now. "I know about the lodge, the late nights, all of it." Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken. How do you know?" "It doesn't matter how I know," I said, leaning back in my chair. "What matters is that you've been lying to me for months, and I want to hear the truth. Right now." Miriam's hands trembled as she ran them through her hair. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it did," I said coldly. "You didn't just stumble into this. You made choices, Miriam. Repeatedly." She looked at me then, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or regret. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "How about why?" I said, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "Why him? Why do this to us?" She stared at the table, silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she said, "I felt invisible, Clayton, like I was just going through the motions. And Brett, he made me feel alive again." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Alive?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You felt alive by sneaking around behind my back? By destroying everything we've built?" "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly, standing up. "You succeeded." I couldn't stay in the same room with her anymore. I walked out, leaving her sitting there, sobbing at the kitchen table. Max followed me to the living room, his eyes wide with concern, and I sat on the couch, burying my face in my hands. I didn't know what hurt more, her betrayal or the fact that she couldn't even explain it in a way that made sense. That night, I slept on the couch, unable to face her. But as I lay there in the dark, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about what she had done. It was about what I was going to do next. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Miriam moving around the kitchen. The scent of coffee filled the air, but it felt foreign now, like a meaningless routine in a house that no longer felt like home. I sat up, my back aching from the couch. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with Brett, saw the way she laughed with him, the way she had looked at me with nothing but regret the night before. Miriam peeked her head into the living room. Her eyes were red and puffy, like she had cried herself to sleep. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I sighed, rubbing my face. "Talk about what, Miriam? The fact that you cheated on me? Or the fact that you lied to my face for months?" She flinched but stepped forward anyway, hugging her arms to her chest. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even expect it. But I need you to understand that I never stopped loving you, Clayton." I let out a bitter laugh. "You have a funny way of showing it." She sat down across from me, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I was selfish," she admitted. I got caught up in something that made me feel young, exciting, like I had control over my own life again. And I didn't stop to think about how much I was destroying in the process. I shook my head. That's the part one don't get, Miriam. We built a life together. We had something real. And you threw it away for what? Some thrill. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Finally, she whispered, I think I was looking for something to blame for the way I was feeling. And instead of talking to you about it, I ran straight into the worst possible decision. I let her words sit between us, hollow and meaningless. Maybe she believed them, but they didn't change the truth. You didn't just cheat, I said. You planned weekends away with him. You told me you loved me while sneaking off to be with him. That's not a mistake, Miriam. That's a choice. Over and over again. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't care. I was past the point of feeling sorry for her. I don't expect you to stay, she said, her voice cracking. But I want you to know that if I could take it all back, I would. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. But you can't take it back, can you? Silence. I stood up, my chest tight. I need space, I said. I need time to figure out where I go from here. She didn't argue. She just nodded, wiping at her tears. I'll stay at my sister's for a few days, she said quietly. I didn't answer. I just walked to the window, watching the world outside continue on as if nothing had happened. When she finally left, suitcase in hand, I didn't watch her go. I just closed my eyes and exhaled. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something close to peace. The silence in the house was deafening. After Miriam left, I stood in the living room for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, my thoughts spinning in circles. I had spent so much time focused on her betrayal, her lies, her excuses, that I hadn't stopped to ask myself what I wanted. What came next for me? I grabbed my jacket and took Max for a long walk. The cold air stung my face, but I welcomed it. Anything to clear my head. As we walked through the park, I watched other people go about their lives. Laughing, holding hands, chasing after their kids. It felt like another world, one I wasn't sure I belonged to anymore. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I hesitated before pulling it out. It was a message from Miriam. Miriam, I'm at my sister's. I know you need space, but please don't shut me out completely. I stared at the screen, my emotions tangled in knots. A part of me wanted to respond, to say something. Anything. But what was there to say? Instead, I shoved the phone back in my pocket and kept walking. The first decision. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table and made myself a cup of coffee. I didn't drink it. I just held it, staring at the steam rising from the surface. This was it. My crossroads. I could try to fix things with Miriam, try to rebuild, to forgive. Or I could walk away and start over, knowing that what we had was broken beyond repair. I wasn't ready to decide just yet, but I was ready to take back control of my life. I spent the rest of the afternoon making a list. Things I had let go of, things I wanted to reclaim, hobbies I had abandoned, friends I had lost touch with, goals I had pushed aside. This wasn't just about Miriam anymore. It was about me. An unexpected message. That evening, as I was cooking dinner, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Miriam. It was Brett. Brett. Can we talk? I nearly dropped the spoon in my hand. Of all the things I had expected, this wasn't one of them. I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. What could he possibly have to say to me? For a long moment, I debated ignoring him. But then I thought, no. I want to hear what he has to say. So I typed back, meet me at Parker's Diner. 9 p.m. I had no idea what I was walking into. But one thing was for sure. I wasn't the same man I had been when this all started. I sat at Parker's Diner, my fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The place was nearly empty, just a few late-night regulars scattered around, lost in their own worlds. Then the door opened, and Brett walked in. He spotted me immediately and made his way over. I expected arrogance, maybe even hostility, but instead he looked uneasy, like he wasn't sure what he was doing here either. He sat down across from me, cleared his throat and said, "I don't expect you to believe me, but I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "You didn't mean to sleep with another man's wife?" He winced. "Okay, fair. I guess what I meant was, I didn't realize what I was getting into. I didn't know you. I didn't think about what it would do to you. And honestly, I regret it." I studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. But he looked genuine, uncomfortable but honest. "I don't need your apology," I said. "I just need to understand why." Brett sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Miriam was lost. She told me things were over between you two emotionally, that you were just going through the motions." My jaw tightened. So that was the story she told him. "I was stupid," he continued. "I should have known better. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed to say it, to own up to it." I took a deep breath. I hadn't come here to fight, and I certainly hadn't come here for closure from him. But strangely enough, hearing him admit his part in all of this made me realize something. I didn't need answers from Miriam anymore. I already had everything I needed to move forward. I pushed my coffee aside and stood up. "You and I don't have anything else to say to each other, Brett. You got what you wanted. Now I'm going to get what I want. A life without any of this." He nodded, looking relieved that I wasn't about to throw a punch. "Fair enough." And with that, I walked out of the diner and into the cool night air, letting go. The next day, I called Miriam and told her I was done. No fights, no drawn-out drama. Just a clean break. I told her I'd be moving out for now, that we'd figure out the details later, but that I wasn't going to spend my life trying to fix something she had shattered. She cried, begged me to reconsider, but I knew in my heart it was the right choice. That afternoon, I packed a bag, called a friend who had a spare room, and left. And for the first time in months I felt free. A fresh start. The days turned into weeks, and I focused on rebuilding my life. I reconnected with old friends. I picked up hobbies I had abandoned. I even signed up for a hiking group, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. And slowly, the pain began to fade. One evening, I was sitting on my friend's porch when Max curled up beside me, tail wagging. The sun was setting, casting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. And I realized something. I wasn't broken. I had lost something, yes. But in losing Miriam, I had found myself again. And that was worth everything.